The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to take a call. Labor is supporting this legislation because we need to. Because if we don't, the consequences are simply far too great. Now, Mr Speaker, that was a shocking speech from a minister that's had a shocking week. That what we've had is a whole lot of excuses, a whole lot of justification, and certainly what you'd say a defensive game in that speech. An absolute defensive game. We had a minister that claimed that before the passage of the EEZ legislation, that there was no regulation in terms of how we governed activities in our oceans. This is simply not correct. And it would be more helpful if the minister were to come into the House and deal with the facts. Because, Mr Speaker, I want to deal with the facts of what we're calling a simple tweak to a not perfect piece of legislation. Because if we have a look at the principal piece of legislation that we're amending here, where we're amending the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf bill, that this is a technical amendment for allow for the transition of 4 existing operations to come within the regulatory regime outlined in the EEZ legislation. Well, let's have a look at the not-so-perfect legislation. The not-so-perfect legislation, when it was first introduced, had to be sent back to Select Committee for an entire rewrite because it was such shoddily drafted legislation. Even after the Select Committee completely rewrote this legislation and thought that it was and got it into a form that it could be brought back to the House and that it was fit for purpose and might actually do something about providing a thorough regulatory regime in terms of protecting our oceans. The minister then had to introduce a 14-page SOP to the principal legislation with even more fix-ups. 1 month later, there was an amendment bill back in this House with 37 pages of amendments to the principal legislation. This is the second time that we've had to come back into this House and use valuable House time to play fix-up on a government that cannot run a legislative agenda and pass legislation that is fit to purpose. That is quite correct, Mr Parker. This is the amendment to the amendment to the amendment bill because this government cannot legislate. Now, when we first had the bill that was at first reading, that we supported at first reading and said that it needed to be sent to Select Committee to examine it. And Mr Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the submissions that we received on this legislation. There were not many of them, but they were incredibly important submissions. I think there were 5 of them. But through the Select Committee process, Mr Speaker, we stopped yet another disastrous piece of legislation. There had to be an amendment to the amendment to the amendment to the amendment at Select Committee because what we'd had was yet another very shoddy piece of work from this government come before this House. That what this bill does is provide for the 4 current operators to be able to transition in. The first of these, that their permission to operate under the old regime. Yes, Minister, there was a regime, unlike what you'd like to say, that their consent expires on the 27th of June of this year. That being the 27th of June, that being the Maui gas field that provides a significant portion of this country's gas, and in fact the department's own report informed us that it is 26% of New Zealand's gas supply, and that when the Maui field resulted in had a 5-day shutdown in operations in 2011, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment calculated a gross cost to gas consumers of $200 million over a 5-day duration. Now, this was a government that had passed legislation that was going to, that could potentially have seen the Maui gas field shut down for an unknown period of time before it could transition into a regulatory regime. I would have thought when there were 4 operators operating that you could have put in a transition provision that would have seen those 4 operators come within the Principal Act in a reasonably seamless way. It doesn't seem like rocket science, Mr Speaker. So when we had the amendment to the amendment to the amendment that came to the House in order to play fix-up on this, what we had was a completely open-ended transitional arrangement fix-up for these operators. Maui Gas, the Maui gas field, fine, that was the 27th of June of this year. But Mr Speaker, the last of these operators that need to get transition into the new regime, their permission to operate expires in 2031. And the legislation that this government brought into this House was going to give an open-ended timeframe on which these people had to lodge their consent. They could have potentially been able to operate forever and a day without having any onus to have a date in which they had to have their homework handed in by or their consent processed. It was only the Select Committee process that picked up yet another failure of this government to understand how it is that you need to put in place a proper regulatory regime. Mr Speaker, this is a government that has shown that it makes mistake after mistake after mistake when it comes to this legislation. This is not legislation that has been on our statute book for a lengthy period of time. This is legislation that was only passed in the 50th Parliament, in the last Parliament, and already we are amending it in such fundamental, well, not fundamental ways, well, things that you'd think when you're thinking about putting in place a new regulatory regime. You think, okay, there's some people already operating. How do we bring them in? What's the timeframes? And how do we make sure that happens smoothly? So, Mr Speaker, I hope, and it is my hope, that this is the last time that we have to use this House's time and this House's resource. Grant Robertson is saying he'd be very surprised. It is Nick Smith. You are correct, Mr Robertson, but I am an ever optimist. I am ever the optimist. The sun is always shining when I see things, and I am hopeful that this is the last time that we will have to pay patch up on bad legislation. And Mr Speaker, the 9 months that we did agree on at Select Committee seems to be a sensible length of time in which it is now that someone has to have their completed application in before their consent expires. Hardly an onerous obligation on the operators, especially the one whose consent doesn't expire to 2031, that they have that consent lodged 9 months before. We did look at a range of options, whether that should be 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, in which we have a look at which those applications need to be lodged. We settled on 9 months. In the collaborative way in which we looked at this, because this would allow for the full 140 working day statutory timeframe for the Environment Protection Agency to consider the marine consent application, with 15 working days to lodge the appeal. So that's approximately 8 months in total. So, Mr Speaker, 9 months did seem to the Select Committee to be a sensible period of time in which we would put this in. Mr Speaker, I think this legislation needs to serve as an important lesson to this House around the need to thoroughly examine legislation. And for the people drafting legislation, when the government brings such important legislation that could have such dire economic consequences, such as denying the country 26% of its natural gas supply, or 26% of its gas supply, actually, if they're because of a botch up in their legislation, that really more homework needs to be done. There needs to be a more thorough examination of the legislation that is brought forward, and to have the Minister in his speech introducing this bill try and spray blame around everywhere except where it needs to fall, and that is on a government that is making mistakes, it's losing its way, and it's failing to meet the needs of New Zealanders. It certainly wouldn't have been meeting the needs of New Zealanders who are dependent on that operation for their jobs. That we do believe that we need to have a managed transition away from fossil fuels, Mr Speaker, but it needs to be just that, managed, not shut down on the 27th of June because the government made a mistake in the drafting of its legislation and couldn't understand the ramifications of a regulatory regime. That this is a government that is completely out of touch with what it needs to be doing in terms of putting in place the right basis. The EPA has made some very sensible decisions under the EEZ legislation. We have seen some decisions where the environment has been considered, and the environment, the EPA has weighed up that actually the activity that has been applied to do would be far too detrimental on the environment. The classic case of this being on the Chatham Rise with Chatham Rock's application under this legislation to mine there, where it was seen that there wouldn't be adequate benefit to the country and too much environmental risk. So, Mr Speaker, Labor will be supporting this bill. We have to. The economic implications are simply far too great.
I call